Hello, and welcome back to Chapter 13 of Ancient and Medieval World History. And in this chapter, we're going to be looking at the period from roughly the middle of the 13th to roughly the middle of the 14th centuries. And so to begin, the Mongol Empire and the Pax Mongolica, which we had talked about in the last chapter, created a stable environment for long-distance trade. And the Silk Road across Central Asia thrived. The safety of these overland caravan routes would allow Europeans, like the Venetian Polo brothers and their young nephew Marco Polo, to reach the court of Kublai Khan in 1271. But at the same time, a northern European trade alliance was growing in a region around the Baltic Sea and the North Sea that had long been dominated by Scandinavian merchants and by the descendants of the Vikings. Merchant guilds or associations that became known as Hansa formed to protect trade routes and to protect cargoes, beginning in the 1140s and the 1150s. In 1159, Henry the Lion, the Duke of Saxony, rebuilt Lübeck, which had been destroyed in a fire, as a German merchant city whose strategic location between the North Sea and the Baltic on the Trave River made it a future center of what became the Hanseatic League. After Henry the Lion granted German merchants equal rights to Gotlanders or Scandinavians, they became increasingly active at places like Visby in Gotland and Novgorod. This gave them access to Russian furs, to wax, and to honey, and it made Novgorod a key eastern trade hub. By 1176, merchants from Cologne were exempted from tolls and were allowed to build their own guild hall in London, in England. Europe adopted magnetic compasses for navigation in 1199 that had been developed in China, and that allowed more dependable travel by sea, especially out of sight of land. By the early 13th century, Germans founded outposts on the eastern Baltic coast at places like Riga in 1201, Reval or Tallinn in 1248, Danzig or Gdansk in 1236, and Elbing in 1237. In 1241, Lübeck and Hamburg established a formal alliance to protect trade routes and to share privileges, such as access to salt from Lunenburg and herring. This was the first major city-to-city pact, often considered the nucleus of the future League. By the 14th century, the Hanseatic League dominated trade in the North and the Baltic Seas. Its contours, or major trading hubs, were located in Bergen, Norway, beginning around 1360, Novgorod, Russia, beginning around 1200, Bruges in Belgium, beginning around 1252, and London in England, also beginning around 1200. These were semi-autonomous, fortified colonies with their own warehouses and churches and courts. The League, however, it's important to note, was not a nation. And unlike later trading companies, such as the British or the Dutch East or West India companies, the League did not have a standing army or a permanent militarized navy. The League was a loose confederation of autonomous cities and of merchants' guilds, which made decisions largely on the basis of what would be the most profitable to them. Military action required agreement of the entire Hansetag, or Council of Member Cities. Often, wealthy members, such as Lübeck or Hamburg or Danzig, were not interested in paying for poorer members' defense. And in their very first attempt, going to war against Denmark in 1361, after the Danes had sacked the city of Visby, the lack of full participation resulted in a humiliating defeat. However, in 1367, 77 cities joined a confederation of Cologne that assembled a fleet of 52 large ships, known as cogs, and about 12,000 soldiers. A year later, this Hanseatic force sacked Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, and occupied parts of Scania and southern Sweden. This victory allowed the League to dominate the herring trade and even to have veto power for a while over the succession to the Danish throne. As the League was gaining power on the sea and in commercial cities, the European countryside was changing as well. And as we'll see, this was largely the result of a disaster that began half a world away, but was carried to Europe by the greatly improved trade networks. As I mentioned in the last chapter, the heirs of Genghis Khan's empire continued its expansion well after his death in 1227. And one of these was his grandson, Kublai Khan, who lived from 1215 to 1294, and who defeated his older brother Mungke to become the Khan in 1260, and then fought off a challenge by a younger brother in 1264. By the early 1270s, Kublai had renamed his eastern regime Dai Yuan and had moved his capital to Khanbalik, which was also called Dadu, which is now known as Beijing. In 1273, Kublai defeated the Southern Song army at Qiangyang, and in 1276, the Song imperial family surrendered to the Yuan, which became the very first non-native dynasty to rule China. The Dowager Empress and her young grandson, the last Song emperor, were settled in Khanbalik on a pension. Kublai led the Yuan dynasty until his death in 1294. He adopted Chinese administrative methods, he repaired the Grand Canal, he encouraged arts and sciences, and he tolerated diverse religions and cultures. Kublai also welcomed European visitors, such as the Polos of Venice, who visited his summer palace at Chengdu, which Europeans would later know as Xanadu, and he appointed Marco Polo to be the Khan's foreign emissary, a position that Polo held for 17 years before he returned to Europe and wrote his famous account of his adventures in the East. The emperor also patronized Muslim merchants and scholars and scientists. Cartographers made detailed and very accurate maps of all of the nations along the Silk Road. And after eliminating the potential for rebellion in Tibet, Kublai named the lamas, or the monks, of the Sakya sect of Tibetan Buddhism as his state chaplains, which made them the most powerful religious figures in the Yuan court, and possibly in all of Chinese history. After his death, however, resentment of this power by other groups, such as the Confucians and the Uyghur Muslims, led to a reduction in the influence of not only the Sakya lamas, but of all Buddhists in the imperial court. During this Pax Mongolia of the early 14th century, the Silk Road reached really its peak success. The extended Mongol Empire controlled pretty much all the territory between the Pacific Ocean and the Black Sea. Caravans and official travelers, diplomats, could cover up to 200 miles a day. And for the first time, people from each end of this long trade route, such as the Polos, were able to visit the other endpoint and return home to tell tales of the exotic cultures they found there. However, this ease of travel had a disastrous, unanticipated consequence when Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that had caused the plague of Justinian, you'll recall, and probably also the Yamnaya era depopulation, rose again to infect humans. The bacteria had been kind of hiding out in rat and gerbil populations in Central Asia, but it spread to humans in Kyrgyzstan, beginning in the 1330s. By 1339, Nestorian Christian gravestones in the region were mentioning pestilence. Disease spread to caravans and to the Mongol armies, such as the one that besieged the Genoese trading colony at Kaffa in Crimea in 1346. When plague began killing the Mongols who were encamped around the city, their corpses were catapulted over the walls to infect the defenders, in what may have been the first documented case of biological warfare. The Genoese fled by ship into the Black Sea, and they carried the disease out of the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. By October 1347, plague-infected ships had reached Constantinople and Messina in Sicily. Plague could be transmitted by contact, but it spread even more through flea bites when rats carrying the bacteria and the fleas moved between ships and warehouses, and then throughout commercial cities. It exploded along the busiest maritime trade routes, from Messina to Genoa, and then to Venice, and then to Marseille. And it spread only a little bit slower along caravan routes, reaching Alexandria, Cairo, Mecca, Persia, Baghdad, and Damascus by 1348, and Ukraine, Poland, and Germany by 1349. The results were catastrophic. The bubonic plague became known as the Black Death in Europe, where it probably killed more than half the population. About a third of the population of the Middle East was also eliminated as well. The number of deaths in Europe may have been a bit higher because in the generation before the plague's arrival, a climate change known as the Little Ice Age had caused crop failures and famine that had reduced the rural population by between 10 and 20% and had left the survivors malnourished and stressed. Even so, once the plague arrived, more people in the cities died than in the countryside. Population centers, especially commercial hubs, often lost up to 2/3 of their residents, while small villages were reduced by only a third to half, which is still very significant. Either way, the Black Death was a nightmare that changed European culture. The church, which was unable to either explain or to prevent the plague, lost a lot of its prestige and its power. The papal city of Avignon, because the popes had moved to France for a while, lost up to 70% of its residents. At the very same time that the church was violently suppressing a flagellant movement in which tens of thousands of lay people would march naked through the streets of European cities, whipping themselves to atone for the sins of humanity that they imagined had caused the pandemic. Pogroms in cities like Strasbourg and Basel and Frankfurt and Mainz drove Jews, who were believed to have poisoned the wells, out of the Rhineland and into Poland and Eastern Europe. Artistic depictions of death proliferated, such as the Danse Macabre that you see here. And death became central in literature like Boccaccio's Decameron, which is a collection of 100 stories told by people, mostly nobles, fleeing plague-ridden Florence, and Chaucer's Piers Plowman, which deals with the labor shortages and social chaos caused by the plague. The poor, of course, died in higher numbers than the rich, both in cities and in the countryside. Of course, there had always been many more poor than rich in both places, but the sudden lack of surplus people who could be expected to meekly obey orders and to produce agricultural surpluses that could be paid to the rulers in taxes, and to serve the nobility in a variety of roles, upset the feudal order that had persisted throughout the Middle Ages across most of Western Europe and Britain. During most of this period, despite the occasional famine, Europe had had more people than were strictly necessary to work the land, and feudal lords had found it easy to replace runaways and rebellious peasants. The loss of half the population created a shortage of farm workers and artisans and domestic servants, even after the initial chaos created by the plague. Wages doubled in the generation after the plague, and the lords found that they could no longer live on the traditional in-kind rents that they had received from peasants. After 1350, tenant farmers also began refusing to do the between 2 and 5 days a week of work on the lord's behalf that had been traditional. and they began breaking the laws and customs that tied them to particular lands. Peasants fled either to towns or to manors that offered lower rents and more freedoms. The landlords and their governments tried to prevent these changes. In 1349, the English king, Edward III, issued an Ordinance of the Laborers that tried to prevent wages from rising above pre-plague levels, tried to impose price controls, and tried to prohibit the wealthy from enticing away each other's servants, and required all people under the age of 60 years old to have a job. The law was ineffective, and it was followed by another Statute of the Laborers in 1351 that was equally unsuccessful. Ongoing attempts by the government and the feudal lords to regulate a peasant class that had discovered how necessary their work actually was to social order led ultimately to a peasants' revolt in 1381 called Wat Tyler's Rebellion that caused the young king, Richard II, to promise to abolish serfdom. This form of semi-slavery that bound peasants to particular estates was not abolished. The king lied to the rebels in order to get them to stand down. But over the next century, the shortage of workers gradually raised wages and living conditions for the poor. Similar uprisings of peasants and sometimes of urban wage workers flared up throughout the other European lands after the plague. A jacquerie, or a peasants' revolt in France, was put down brutally in 1358. Heavily armed cavalry, mounted knights, rode down crowds of farmers that were described by the authorities as a rebel army. After its leader was lured into a supposed negotiation and then tortured and beheaded. About 20,000 rebels were killed before the lords regained control. For over a century, beginning in the 1360s, peasants revolted in the German principalities, again with little success. In cities, the workers were similarly unsuccessful. In the late 1370s, Florentine Ciampi, or wool carders, briefly seized power and created a guild to protect their interests. But a counter-coup defeated them, dissolved their guild, and executed the ringleaders. A generation-long revolt in Catalonia, in Spain, that began in 1462, was actually successful in forcing an abolition of serfdom there. But this came in 1462, after a century of peasant suppression. Although the peasant and the city workers' revolts after the plague were mostly unsuccessful, changing economic conditions and the increase of the value of labor gradually did improve the lot of the poor in European society. And there had actually been some governmental changes as well, even before the plague hit, that paved the way for some of these improvements. As we saw in the previous chapter, the Magna Carta had set some expectations for decreasing the excesses of the monarchy, but the hoped-for liberalization didn't really amount to much. In the 1220s, though, knights began to be consulted on taxation in some counties, and by 1254, knights from every shire or county were elected to be sent to Westminster to consult with the king and consent on a tax, and probably also to help to collect it. In the 1260s, the Baron Simon de Montfort, an opponent of King Henry III in the Second Barons' War, began convening councils of elected representatives. This innovation culminated in Montfort's first parliament in 1265, which brought together all of the earls and barons, but also 2 knights from every shire and 2 burgesses, or wealthy citizens, from each major city and borough. Montfort managed to capture King Henry III and to be the de facto ruler of England in 1264 and 1265, but Henry's son, Edward I, known as Edward Longshanks, led the army that crushed the Barons' Rebellion, and Montfort was killed and brutally dismembered. When Longshanks became king in 1272, however, Edward I did see the benefits of the idea of having a parliament to ratify his edicts, and he summoned the burgesses and the knights to Westminster in 1275. By 1290, when Parliament voted to expel the Jews from England, and then offered King Edward the largest tax ever in return for an edict to that effect, the representative body was meeting regularly. And in 1295, what later became known as the Model Parliament was called by Edward on the principle quod omnes tangit ab omnibus approbari debet, which means what touches all should be approved by all. At the end of his reign, in the first decade of the 14th century, Edward I was forced to agree that he would not levy taxes without the consent of the realm, including what was becoming known as the Commons. His successor, Edward II, was a terrible failure on the battlefield and a terrible administrator. In 1311, the new ordinances were published, further limiting his royal power. The king revoked the ordinances in 1322, but he did accept the reality that taxation required consent. And in 1327, Edward II was deposed by the Lords and the Commons, the first and the only time that has ever happened, and which helped to establish Parliament as a central institution in English government. In the next decades, during the 50-year reign of Edward III, the Commons was able to force the king to redress grievances before they would agree to raise revenue for him. And they forced him to accept that no money at all could be raised through taxes or loans without Parliament's consent. At the end of the 1340s, the Commons started meeting separately from the Lords, and the knights and burgesses began electing a Speaker of the House for their body. Ironically, one place the plague did result in a major political change was where it had begun, China. Actually, by the time disease reached Europe, bubonic plague had been devastating the Chinese population for over a decade. The earliest outbreaks may have been as early as 1331, where chronicles in Hebei, around Beijing, describe sudden mass deaths with swollen lymph nodes. Records from the 1330s to the 1350s describe the Great Dying, with entire villages and city wards emptied, with corpses left unburied, and yuan tax collectors failing to bring any revenue back to the government because there was just nobody left alive to pay. Like Europe, China lost up to half its population, or about 40 million people. And like Europe, the Chinese population had already been hit hard by famines in the decades before the plague arrived. Changes in climate, probably also resulting from the Little Ice Age, caused disastrous floods of the Yellow River. The irrigation system was badly damaged, and when plague arrived, there was no one to fix it or to tend the rice fields. The failure of social systems like these in China is often interpreted as a loss by the rulers of what the Chinese called the Mandate of Heaven. Added to this, a secret Buddhist sect called the White Lotus began preaching a message of end times apocalypse that seemed to a lot of people to be playing out in the social chaos of the famine and the plague, along with a salvationist expectation that a new age would follow the chaos. A young orphan named Zhu Yuanzhang, who had lost his entire family to the plague and the famine, was sheltered at a White Lotus monastery around 1345. When the local Yuan commander burned the temple to the ground, Zhu joined a rebel group called the Red Turbans. Zhu quickly became a very successful rebel leader, showing tactical talent and building a strong personal network of refugees and orphans like himself. Zhu married the daughter of the Red Turbans leader, and after his father-in-law's death in 1355, he took command of the entire rebel army. Within a year, the 28-year-old former monk had captured Nanjing and controlled southern China. By 1368, he gained control of the rest of China, claimed the Mandate of Heaven, and declared himself the first emperor of the Ming dynasty. Zhu chose the name Hongwu, which means expansively martial, and he ruled for 30 years. During that period, he built the world's largest granary system to prevent a future famine. He repaired the canal and irrigation system and built over 40,000 reservoirs. And he planted over 1 billion trees to reverse the Mongol practice of trying to make China look more like the Asian steppe. Hongwu resented the government officials and the local landlords that had hoarded rice while his family had starved. And he revised the Confucian system to make the examinations even more open to talented commoners. Hongwu had risen from the very lowest rung of Chinese society to the top. But that rise had left scars. As emperor, he was extremely frugal, wearing patched robes and eating simple meals. He was also either paranoid or very intent on punishing the officials that he believed had betrayed China during the plague and the famine. In 1376, he executed several thousand officials that had been convicted of corruption. In 1380, he eliminated his chancellor and the man's entire faction of about 40,000, killing relatives to the 9th degree. In 1393, he accused a famous general of treason and purged about 20,000 from the highest levels of the military aristocracy. But the order that Hongwu imposed did seem to benefit Chinese society and to confirm the mandate of heaven. Chinese population surged again from 60 to 85 million during his reign. By 1393, 2/3 of the land was owned by small farmers, and the tax burden on peasants had fallen to its lowest level in centuries. Centralized granaries eliminated food insecurity for nearly 2 centuries. Nanjing became a magnificent planned capital with the world's largest city walls. And rural areas gained thousands of state-sponsored schools as the Confucian system was expanded. Many historians credit Hongwu's reign with being really the only successful peasant revolt in Chinese history, led by a real peasant. It's at least fair to say, I think, that he established the most pro-peasant, anti-commercial, anti-oligarchic, and rural utopian regime that China ever had, which has influenced its history all the way to the present. Between China and Europe, the Mongols and the Black Death rearranged the Islamic world, wiping out old empires and setting the scene for new ones. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which overthrew the Ubaid dynasty, defended the region against the Mongols, and in 1260 won the first ever victory in which a Mongol army was destroyed. Then from the 1270s onward, Mamluk, Egypt, and Syria became the richest and most militarized Sunni state. And they defeated the final Crusader state, Acre, in 1291. In Persia and Mesopotamia, the Ilkhanate conquered Baghdad in 1258. West of this Ilkhanate empire, beginning in 1324, Osman I began raiding the Byzantine province of Bithynia on the southern shoreline of the Black Sea. Over the next half-century, the Osmanli, or Ottoman, principality continued to grow into the power vacuum that had been created by the collapse of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. In the 1330s, the Ottomans captured Nicaea and Nicomedia, and in 1354 they gained their first foothold in Europe when they conquered Gallipoli, taking advantage of an earthquake that damaged the city's walls. During this period, the Ottomans began training Christian boys that had been taken as tribute in the Balkans to create an elite infantry force known as the Janissaries. And the Janissaries and the Ottomans, of course, will become even more significant in the next chapter when they take over Constantinople. But that's all for today. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.